A world. Famous CEO travels to Europe for a high-profile conference, but what should have been a routine dinner turns into a shocking moment of discrimination. In a single night, his life, career, and beliefs about equality are put to the ultimate test. This is the true-to-life-inspired story of David Johnson, a groundbreaking black CEO who thought he had seen everything success could offer. But one evening in Paris, he was refused service in a prestigious restaurant, not because of his reservation, not because of his credentials, but because of the color of his skin. That moment ignites an international conversation, reveals deep layers of European culture and history, and forces David to confront not only injustice abroad, but also his own memories of fighting bias at home. From the cafes of Paris to the halls of Brussels, his journey becomes a portrait of resilience, dignity, and a fight for change that resonates far beyond a single table. The morning began like a piece of music that hadn't yet found its tempo. David Johnson's alarm went off at 5:45 a.m., a soft chime on his phone that he normally ignored 3 times before rising. Today he got up on the first ring. The hotel room in London was still dark, curtains drawn against the winter morning, but his mind was already racing. He showered quickly, letting the hot water wake his muscles, then dressed in the charcoal suit he always wore for major speeches. He had been in Europe dozens of times before, but this felt different, more ceremonial somehow, more like a return to a place he had always imagined rather than merely visited. He packed his notes, a slim leather folder, and slipped his father's old cufflinks into his shirt. They were small squares of brushed silver, worn at the edges. His father had given them to him on his first job interview. "Always dress like you belong at the table," his father had said. He had never forgotten. At 6:15 he left the hotel and took a black cab through London's early traffic, the streets shining with rain. He watched office workers huddle under umbrellas, the occasional delivery van rumbling past. He thought about the speech he was about to give on European innovation and ethical technology, about how he wanted to do more than impress investors. He wanted to open a conversation about justice and inclusion. At St. Pancras Station, the great iron ribs of the roof loomed above a scattering of travelers. He checked in for the Eurostar, passed through security, and found his seat. The train hummed under him as he settled by the window. Across the aisle, a woman spoke rapid French into her phone. Behind him, a child played a game on a tablet. He took out his notebook and began scribbling lines for his keynote, revising, tightening, letting the rhythm of the train shape his thoughts. As the train slid out of London, dawn began to seep across the horizon, a pale wash of light over frosted fields. He remembered coming to Paris as a student, broke and awed, eating bread on the steps of the Sacré-Sébire. He thought about how much had changed, how he now sat on the board of a global tech company, how people listened when he spoke. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small part of him still felt like that student, unsure he truly belonged. The train plunged into the tunnel under the channel. Darkness roared past the windows, broken only by faint emergency lights. He closed his eyes and pictured the day ahead, the conference, the dinner reservation at La Belle Époque, the quiet thrill of finally entering a place he had only read about. He imagined a soft chair, crystal glasses, his colleagues at the table, a perfect European evening after a successful speech. He could almost taste the wine. When the train emerged into France, fields stretched out in a flat expanse, dotted with farmhouses. The sun was rising now, gold edges on the clouds. David sipped coffee from a paper cup, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. He thought about his father again, about the last time he had called him from Europe. "You've earned your place," his father had said. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." By the time they approached Paris Gare du Nord, David felt centered, rehearsed, ready. He straightened his tie, closed his notebook, and glanced at the time. It was 7:55 a.m. In a few minutes the train would stop, and the day would begin. The train slid into Gare du Nord with a hiss of brakes, and a scatter of pigeons rising from the platform. David stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs, then took his briefcase from the rack. The station smelled of diesel, coffee, and damp wool, a mixture he always associated with arrival. Around him, commuters hurried with eyes on their phones, a tide of languages. French, Arabic, English, Dutch, swirling in the vaulted hall. He followed the signs toward the exit. Outside, the air was sharp with winter, a faint drizzle misting his cheeks. Taxis lined the curb, engines idling, drivers leaning against their doors. A man in a black suit held a placard with his name, Monsieur Johnson. The man asked. David nodded and shook his hand. They walked together to a sleek black car and slid inside. As the car threaded through Paris traffic, David pressed his forehead lightly to the window and watched the city drift past. It wasn't the postcard Paris of tourists, but the working city at morning rush. Boulangeries releasing clouds of bread scent, schoolchildren in puffy jackets, delivery trucks wedged into narrow streets. A radio played low in the front seat, a debate about upcoming elections. He thought about how each European city had its own rhythm and its own unspoken codes, and how easily you could slip into feeling like a guest no matter how much money or status you carried. They reached the conference center just after 8:30. It was a modern glass and steel structure on the edge of the sign, banners flapping with the logo of the European Innovation Forum. Inside, a bustle of attendees milled about, all sleek laptops and whispered strategy. Lucas was waiting near the registration desk, wearing a crisp gray suit and an earnest smile. "You're here," he said in English, clasping David's hand. "We're ready upstairs." They rode an escalator to a hall lined with photographs of past European tech luminaries. Elena met them near the speaker's lounge, her hair tucked under a black beret, eyes already scanning the crowd for potential interviews. "You'll be great," she said softly, handing David a badge. "They're expecting something big." David ducked into a quiet green room to adjust his tie and review his notes. He felt the low hum of anticipation in the building. Keynote speeches always carried a performative weight, but here in Paris, at a conference attended by ministers and CEOs, it felt almost like a ritual. He thought of the dinner later, the table waiting at La Belle Époque, the promise of a reward after the work was done. At 900 sharp, a staffer knocked. "Monsieur Johnson, we're ready for you." David walked down a corridor and out into the glare of stage lights. Hundreds of faces looked up at him from tiered seating, some holding phones to record. Cameras streamed to a global audience. The moderator introduced him in French and English, citing his achievements and the importance of his company's projects. Applause rolled across the room like a tide. David stepped to the podium and began to speak. He talked about the promise of Europe as a laboratory for ethical technology, about transparency and privacy, about how digital infrastructure could either widen or close inequalities. His voice steadied after the first few sentences. He found his rhythm, punctuating points with gestures, weaving in anecdotes from Detroit, Lagos, Berlin. He spoke about building trust across cultures and about the moral responsibility of innovators. For a moment, the audience was completely silent, leaning forward. He finished with a call for partnership. "Progress," he said, "is not a solo performance. It's a shared table. It's time we make sure everyone is seated at it." Applause thundered again, longer this time, punctuated by flashes from photographers. He bowed his head slightly, stepped back, and exhaled. After the speech, a crowd of delegates swarmed him with questions, cards, and compliments. He smiled and answered, but a part of him was already drifting ahead to the evening. In his mind's eye, he saw the polished wood of La Belle Époque, the low clink of cutlery, the velvet booths. He could almost taste the first sip of wine. The day felt like it was unfolding exactly as planned. By 10:00 a.m., he was seated in a private lounge with Lucas and Alina, coffee steaming in cups, a tray of croissants between them. Lucas flipped through his phone, showing enthusiastic tweets from attendees. Elena was drafting an article about the speech for her paper. David leaned back in his chair, letting the adrenaline ebb, the city humming outside the windows. He didn't know yet that the most significant event of his day wouldn't be the keynote, but a simple dinner reservation on a rainy Parisian street. By the time David finished his second cup of coffee, the conference center had fully come alive. Attendees streamed in and out of side rooms, clutching folders and whispering strategies in a dozen languages. The scent of fresh pastries drifted from a catering station near the back wall. Screens displayed panels titled Trust in the Digital Era and Cross-Border Innovation. A soft buzz of optimism hovered in the air, but beneath it David sensed something harder, an invisible lattice of alliances and exclusions, the quiet hierarchies of power. Lucas led him through a warren of hallways toward a private meeting with a delegation from Brussels. On the way, David noticed glances, some warm, some appraising, a few oddly guarded. He'd been in enough boardrooms to know the difference. Elena walked a half step behind, her phone always raised, snapping pictures, jotting notes. "Everyone wants a piece of you today," she murmured. The delegation was waiting in a glass, walled room with a view of the sign. They exchanged handshakes, then slid into chairs around a polished table. For the next hour, David outlined his vision for an ethical data exchange platform that could benefit European municipalities. They asked probing questions about privacy, regulation, and costs. He answered smoothly, but he felt the effort in his shoulders, the faint throb behind his temples. As they wrapped up, one of the officials, a young man in a navy suit, leaned forward and said in a lowered voice, "You know, Mr. Johnson, there are still some places here. Not everyone will treat you as they should. You've probably noticed." David gave a small smile, unsure how to respond, and thanked him for his time. When they stepped out of the room, Lucas said quietly, "Strange thing for him to say." David shrugged. "Maybe just warn me about the competition." But the remark hung between them like an uninvited guest. At 11:00 a.m., David was ushered into a media area for a series of interviews. Bright lights, makeup artists dusting his forehead, microphones clipped to his lapel. He answered questions about innovation, the American tech scene, and his childhood in Detroit. Elena watched from the corner, fingers flying across her screen, already turning sound bites into a narrative. A producer asked him to repeat his line about the shared table, and he did, smiling, but felt a flicker of discomfort. It was easy to speak of inclusion on stage, harder to live it out in the world beyond the conference walls. Between interviews, he checked his phone and email from his assistant confirming the dinner reservation at La Belle Époque for 7:30 p.m., a note from his company's legal team about a pending contract, a text from his sister back home reminding him to call their mother. The normal weave of his life threaded across the glowing screen. He slid the phone back into his pocket, trying to stay present. He and Lucas grabbed bottled water and slipped into a side corridor to breathe. Through the glass wall, they could see the sign, gray under a leaden sky. Boats moved sluggishly downstream. "Everything set for tonight?" Lucas asked. "Yes," David said. "La Belle Époque at 7:30. I've dreamed about it for years." Lucas grinned. "It's like stepping into a movie." David laughed softly. "I hope it's not a tragedy." At 11:45 a.m., Alina rejoined them, holding a notebook covered in scribbles. "You're trending already," she said. "Clips of your speech all over Twitter. People like the table metaphor." She lowered her voice. "It's strange, though. There's also a thread about discrimination in Paris restaurants. Some journalists posted a story about being refused service in Saint-Germain. It's going viral." David raised an eyebrow. Coincidence? Maybe, Elena said, tucking the notebook under her arm. They returned to the lounge where a buffet had been laid out for speakers. David picked at a small plate of salad, more out of politeness than hunger. The room buzzed with polite conversation, but his mind drifted. He thought about his father's cufflinks, about the boy he had been, about how sometimes success simply put you in a more expensive waiting room rather than erasing the old barriers. He felt a tremor of fatigue run through him and shook it off. Tonight, he promised himself, it would be different. A perfect meal in a perfect city, a chance to let go. By noon, the conference's bells chimed to signal the next round of panels. David glanced at his watch. 7.5 hours until dinner. The day still felt under his control. He didn't know that somewhere across town, in a kitchen lined with copper pots, a maître d'hôtel had already made a quiet decision that would shatter that control before the night was over. By noon, the conference center was buzzing with the restless energy of lunchtime. Delegates streamed into the wide atrium where long tables groaned under the weight of baguettes, cheeses, smoked salmon, and rows of tiny éclairs. David filled a plate half-heartedly, more to blend in than out of appetite. He stood near a tall window overlooking the sign, biting into a piece of bread, tasting the crust crackle before giving way to softness. It was good, almost too good, the kind of bread that reminded him of the first time he had come to Paris as a student and eaten nothing but bakery scraps for 3 days. Lucas joined him with a plate piled high, eating with the enthusiasm of someone who had no time for appearances. You should try the goat cheese, Lucas said with his mouth half full. David smiled faintly, letting the moment breathe. He liked Lucas's lack of pretense. It anchored him in rooms full of polished surfaces. Elena approached, balancing a coffee and flipping through her notes. The panel after lunch is packed, she said. You've become the unofficial star of the conference. Everyone's quoting you. She tapped her pen against her notebook. But I've also been overhearing things. A few delegates were whispering that La Belle Époque is selective, not just exclusive in price, but in people. David frowned. Selective how? Elena hesitated. You know how old establishments can be. There are stories. Who gets seated where? Who's told there's no table? Who's asked for extra documents? Most people ignore it because it's Paris, and because the food is supposed to be worth the humiliation. She paused. I just want you to be ready, in case anything feels off. David laughed lightly, though it came out sharper than he intended. Elena, it's 2025. They take my money, they take my suit, they'll serve me dinner. That's how the world works. She didn't argue, only scribbled something in her notebook and looked away. The afternoon sessions dragged on. David sat on a panel about digital responsibility, fielding questions about artificial intelligence and ethics. He answered smoothly, but his mind drifted to the evening ahead. At one point, as another speaker launched into a dense monologue, David checked the restaurant's website on his phone, scrolling through the menu, scallops with black truffle, pigeon with figs, a wine list that read like poetry. He imagined the table set for 3, Lucas across from him, Elena to the side, laughter rising above candlelight. At 1:30 p.m., he stepped outside for a short walk to clear his head. The sky hung low and gray, the streets damp from an earlier drizzle. Paris carried its usual mid-day rhythm, shopkeepers sweeping stoops, students on scooters, traffic honking as if in conversation. David walked along the sign, watching the water churn sluggishly under stone bridges. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the river, sending it to his sister with the caption, "Back in Paris, thinking of Dad." She replied almost instantly, he'd be proud. "Call me when you can." He tucked the phone back in his pocket and leaned on the bridge's balustrade, staring at the water. For a brief moment he felt a heaviness in his chest, a whisper of doubt. He thought again of Alina's warning, the strange remark from the Brussels official, the way the maître at some hotels had eyed him in the past. He shook it off. This was a new Europe, he told himself, and tonight he would prove it to himself. Back at the conference around 2:15 p.m., he sat for one last interview with a German broadcaster. The host asked about cultural barriers in Europe. "We're all guests somewhere," David replied carefully. "The question is whether the host truly welcomes us." The words slipped out before he could polish them. The host smiled thinly, as if sensing the irony of the statement. By 2:50 p.m., the day's panels wound down. Delegates checked their phones. Taxis queued outside. Lucas handed David a printed schedule for the evening, a quick debrief with investors at 5:00, then dinner at 7:30 sharp. "I called the restaurant," Lucas said. "Everything's confirmed. Don't worry." David nodded, glancing at his watch. 4.5 hours to go. He felt tired but oddly restless, as if the day itself were holding its breath. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed a crack forming in the script he had written for himself, though he could not yet see where it would split open. By 3 o'clock, the conference center had thinned out. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked coats, and the echo of departing footsteps reverberated off the glass walls. David loosened his tie, exhaling for what felt like the first time all day. Lucas appeared with his jacket slung over his arm, Alana behind him tapping messages into her phone. "We've got 2 free hours before the investor debrief," Lucas said. "Want to see the city?" David nodded. The three of them stepped outside into the damp Paris afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the air held that clean, metallic scent that follows a storm. Traffic hissed along slick streets. They walked along Rue de Rivoli, passing shuttered boutiques and kiosks selling postcards of the Eiffel Tower. David felt the shift from corporate air to public air, from the curated halls of the conference to the unpredictable texture of the city. Alina led them toward a quiet square lined with chestnut trees. She spoke about the history of the buildings, about painters who had lived in garrets above the shops, about how Europe carried its ghosts in plain sight. David listened, half distracted, his gaze on the cobblestones slick with rain. He liked how the city felt both ancient and alive, a place that had absorbed centuries of mistakes and triumphs, yet still smelled of fresh bread and cigarette smoke. At 3:30 they ducked into a café with a green awning and took a corner table. The owner, a short man with thick glasses, greeted them with warmth and served them espresso without hesitation. David found himself relaxing in the cramped space, the sound of clinking cups, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of French filling his ears. He thought about how simple it could be. A small table, 3 cups. No one making him prove he belonged. They lingered there until nearly 4:15, then walked toward the left bank. The streets grew narrower, the shop windows more antique. Elena snapped photos of painted doors and tiled mosaics. Lucas pointed out a tiny bookstore where James Baldwin had once read aloud from a draft of Giovanni's Room. "This city," Lucas said softly, "has always been a mirror. It shows people what they want to see, but also what they fear." David smiled. "That's poetic for a lawyer." "Law is poetry in a courtroom," Lucas replied, and they both laughed. At 5:00 they returned to the hotel for the investor debrief. A handful of financiers waited in a small salon off the lobby, sipping mineral water. The meeting lasted 40 minutes, full of the usual hedged commitments and careful praise. David performed his role smoothly, but felt his mind tugging forward to dinner. Every time his phone buzzed, he half expected a message from the restaurant canceling the reservation. None came. By 5:50 the debrief was over. Lucas checked his watch. "We've got just over an hour before dinner. Want to freshen up?" David agreed. They went up to their rooms. David washed his face, changed into a dark blue suit, adjusted his father's cufflinks. He stared at his reflection for a long moment, not liking how tense his eyes looked. He tried to soften his expression and practiced a smile. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, not an ordeal. At 60:30, he met Lucas and Elena in the lobby. Lucas wore a gray suit with a narrow tie. Elena had changed into a black dress and carried a small leather notebook in her purse. "Ready?" Lucas asked. "Ready," David said. They stepped out into the street where a black car waited to take them to La Belle Époque. The driver threaded through evening traffic, past glowing shop windows and street lamps flickering on one by one. Paris at twilight looked like a painting behind glass. David watched the city roll past and tried to steady the rhythm of his breathing. In 20 minutes, they would be at the door of the restaurant he had dreamed about for years. He imagined the chandeliers, the velvet banquets, the silverware polished until it shone. He imagined being treated like any other patron. No fuss, no questions, just dinner. But a small voice inside him whispered, what if Elena was right? What if the warning signs were real? He forced himself to ignore it, staring out at the blurred lights as the car glided toward the restaurant, carrying all three of them toward the moment that would define the night. The car slowed as it turned onto a narrow, cobblestone street glowing with lantern light. At the far end stood La Belle Époque, its brass doors gleaming under an ornate archway. Inside, chandeliers burned with a soft amber glow. David felt a thrill, like stepping into a photograph. Lucas leaned forward to peer through the windshield. "It's beautiful," he said. Alana raised her phone and discreetly filmed the façade. The driver stopped. David stepped out first, straightening his suit jacket, feeling the cool night air slide over his skin. He smelled butter and wine drifting out of the kitchen vents. This was exactly as he had pictured it. They climbed the few stone steps to the entrance. A tall Mactradilla in a crisp white shirt and black vest opened the door, smiling briefly at Lucas and Elena. His eyes flicked to David, then back again, the smile tightening. "Bonsoir," Lucas said cheerfully. "Reservation for Johnson, 7:30. The Mactradilla scanned his list, his pen hovering. "I'm sorry, monsieur," he said finally, his voice polite but brittle. "We have no reservation under that name." Lucas frowned. What confirmed this afternoon? He pulled out his phone and showed the email. The Mactradilla barely glanced at it. "Perhaps there was a mistake," he said. "We are fully booked tonight." David stepped forward. "We booked weeks ago. I'm David Johnson." He extended his hand. The Mactra did not take it. "I'm afraid we cannot accommodate you." The man repeated, more firmly this time. "Perhaps another evening." Alina's brow furrowed. "We see empty tables inside," she said. "You're telling us every one of them is reserved." The Mactradilla gave a thin smile. Appearances can be deceiving. Something in David's chest went cold. He glanced through the door clusters of diners, mostly white, sipping wine under chandeliers. Half the tables are empty, exactly as Elena had said. His palms started to sweat. He tried to keep his voice even. "Is there a dress code issue?" "Your attire is fine," the man said. "We simply cannot accommodate you tonight." Lucas began to argue, but David lifted a hand. Years of corporate training told him that arguing would make it worse. He inhaled slowly. "We have traveled a long way. I would like to speak with the manager." "I am the manager," the man replied. For a long beat they stood there, 3 against 1. People inside were glancing over, curious but pretending not to notice. A couple walking past on the street slowed down, sensing the tension. Alana spoke softly, her voice like a blade. "You know this looks very bad." She held up her phone. "We're journalists. We document things." The Mactradilla stiffened. "Please, madame, do not film inside." But his tone wavered. He seemed to realize this moment had already slipped beyond his control. David felt a deep tremor rise from his stomach. Anger, shame, disbelief. But he kept his face neutral. He reached into his wallet, pulled out his business card, and placed it on the podium. "This is who I am," he said quietly. "I will remember tonight." Then he turned to Lucas and Alina. "Let's go." They walked back down the steps into the street. The night air felt colder now, sharper. David's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Lucas muttered under his breath, pacing beside him. Alina was already typing furiously on her phone. Half a block away, they stopped under a street lamp. David leaned against the cold stone wall, staring at his hands. "It happened," he said softly. "I thought it wouldn't, but it did." Alina looked up. "We have a video. We have timestamps. This will go viral." He shook his head. "I'm tired of going viral. I wanted dinner." His voice cracked a little on the last word. Lucas touched his arm. "You don't have to go back there, but you don't have to let it slide either. You're not alone." For a moment they stood in silence, the three of them framed by the glow of the lamp, the restaurant's golden facade receding behind them like a mirage. Around them the city went on, scooters buzzing past, a couple laughing at a cafe, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. Life continuing indifferent. David straightened slowly. "Find me another place," he said finally. "Somewhere small. Somewhere they don't care who I am." Alina put her phone away. "I know just the place." They walked off toward a side street, the glow of the restaurant fading. Behind them, La Belle Époque shimmered like a sealed world, its chandeliers glittering over empty tables that had been reserved. They walked deeper into the left bank, away from the glow of the big restaurants, and into a quieter grid of streets where the shutters were chipped and the menus handwritten in chalk. Alina led them to a tiny bistro squeezed between a laundromat and a bookshop. Inside, the walls were lined with old movie posters, the light low and amber. A man behind the counter greeted them with a nod, wiped his hands on a towel, and led them to a table by the window. No questions, no hesitation, no sideways glances. David sat down and felt the weight of the last hour settle over him. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the menu. Lucas ordered wine, Alina ordered soup. When the food arrived, it was simple. Bread still warm from the oven, a pot of mussels, a bottle of red wine with no label. It was better than he expected, not for the taste, but for the lack of ceremony. As they ate, Elena's phone began to vibrate. She glanced at the screen. "It's already trending," she said quietly. "I uploaded a clip of the Maitre d'. It's everywhere. People are furious." David chewed slowly, staring out the window at the rain-slick street. He didn't feel vindicated, just exhausted. "I didn't want a story," he said softly. "I wanted a meal." "You got both?" Lucas said gently. "Now people can see what's still happening." Alina placed her phone face down. "It's bigger than one restaurant now. Commentators are debating racism in Europe, CEOs speaking out, hashtags forming. Some are calling for a boycott of La Belle Époque. Journalists are asking for interviews." David poured himself a little more wine. "Let them talk. Tonight I'm just a man at a table." They sat in silence for a while. The bistro's door opened and closed as locals drifted in. The cook laughed with someone at the counter. A dog curled up under a chair. The normalness of it felt almost holy. Near midnight, Lucas settled the bill. Outside, the air was damp and cool, and the streets almost empty. They walked slowly back toward David's hotel. Alina filmed bits of the city. Street lamps reflected in puddles, an accordion player on a bridge, David walking alone ahead of them. By the time they reached the hotel lobby, the news cycle had fully turned. David's phone lit up with missed calls from media outlets in London and New York. His inbox overflowed with interview requests. He switched the phone off. "Tomorrow," he said to Lucas and Alina. "Tonight I need to sleep." He rode the elevator alone. In his room, he loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his shoes. Outside, Paris was still glowing but muted, a city that had given him its best and worst in a single day. He thought of his father's cufflinks, of the boy on a bridge snapping photos of the river that morning, of the man who had been denied a table that evening. All the same person, but changed. He opened the window a crack and let the night air in. Below, a delivery truck rattled down the street. He whispered, almost to himself, "I'm still here." On the nightstand his phone buzzed one last time. He ignored it, closed his eyes, and lay back. The city hummed. In the morning the world would demand statements, apologies, and action. But for now, in the dark of a Paris hotel room, David finally allowed himself to feel tired, to let the day end, to drift into sleep with the smell of rain and bread still clinging to his memory. The alarm buzzed softly at 6. David reached for his phone, then remembered he'd turned it off. Outside the window, Paris was wrapped in a thin gray mist. He lay still for a moment, feeling the aftertaste of yesterday in his body like a low ache. His father's cufflinks were still on the nightstand. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and poured a glass of water from the hotel carafe. The city was quiet at this hour, a brief pause before the engines of commerce and traffic roared to life. He thought about canceling his meetings, slipping out to the airport, but something inside him resisted. He had come to Europe to speak about trust and transparency. Running now would feel like surrender. He dressed slowly, choosing a dark turtleneck instead of a suit, then slipped on his coat and stepped into the corridor. The lobby smelled of coffee and furniture polish. Lucas sat in an armchair scrolling his phone, his hair damp from the shower. "Good morning," he said, a little too brightly. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," David said. "But I'm awake." Elena arrived moments later, wearing a trench coat and carrying a camera bag. "The video's been picked up by half a dozen outlets," she said quietly. "It's gone far beyond us now." They walked together into the morning air, heading toward a small cafe near the Sorbonne. The city at dawn felt different, delivery trucks unloading crates of oranges, a baker pulling warm baguettes from an oven, a lone violinist practicing under a bridge. David noticed everything with a new clarity. He also noticed how people looked at him, some with recognition, others with curiosity. Inside the cafe, the tables were small and round, the floor tiled in a mosaic of blue and cream. A young woman behind the counter greeted them with a cheerful "bonjour" and poured 3 cafés crème without asking for their order. David sipped the hot, bitter drink, feeling the warmth seep into his hands. Elena opened her laptop. "There's been an outpouring of support," she said. "Letters, tweets, offers of legal action. Some want to organize a protest outside the restaurant." David shook his head. "Let them. I'm not ready to be anyone's symbol." Lucas leaned forward. "You have to decide, though. In Europe, stories like this resonate differently. They're about more than race. They're about who belongs, who doesn't." David stared out the window at the students hurrying past with books under their arms. "I've always believed culture moves forward slowly, incrementally. But yesterday felt like being yanked back decades." After breakfast, they walked to the Jardin du Luxembourg. The gravel paths were still damp from rain, chestnut trees heavy with dew. Old men played chess on stone tables, children sailed toy boats in the fountain. David sat on a green metal chair and watched the sky brighten. "My father used to talk about Europe like it was a promise," he said quietly. "A place where you could escape the weight of history. I guess there's no escaping it." Elena said nothing, just filmed the sailboats gliding across the fountain. Lucas checked his phone and murmured, "They've invited you to speak at the EU Parliament tomorrow. They want you to talk about inclusion." David let out a short, incredulous laugh. "One day I couldn't get a table at a restaurant. The next day I'm an expert witness for Europe's soul." They spent the rest of the morning wandering through narrow streets of the Latin Quarter. At a small gallery, they paused to look at black and white photographs of post-war Paris. In a boulangerie, David bought a loaf of bread and tore off a piece to eat as he walked. It tasted earthy and dense, nothing like the bread back home. He felt, for the first time since yesterday, a flicker of peace. By early afternoon, they arrived at a riverside bookshop where the owner, an older man with a silver beard, recognized David from the news. "I am ashamed," the man said softly in English. "Paris is not always like that. Here, you are welcome." He pressed a book of Baldwin essays into David's hands. "Take this." He wrote these words just across the river. David thanked him and felt a lump in his throat. He had read Baldwin as a teenager, devouring the sentences like instructions for survival. Holding the book now felt like receiving a compass. They returned to the hotel for calls. Journalists from London, Berlin, and Rome left messages. Activists tagged him in posts. His company's board wanted a statement. Lucas whispered, "You're trending in 20 countries." David stared at the Baldwin book and said, "I didn't ask for this." As evening fell, he slipped away alone. He walked along the Seine as the sun sank behind Notre Dame, the water turning molten gold. He crossed to the Iole Saint Louis and entered a small wine bar tucked under an archway. Inside it smelled of oak and tobacco. He ordered a glass of red and sat by the window. An elderly man at the next table began speaking to him in French, then switched to English when he saw David's confusion. "You are an American," the man said gently. "I saw you on television. Paris can be cruel, but it can also heal. Stay long enough and you will see both." David raised his glass. "To heal," he said. By the time he returned to the hotel, it was nearly midnight. The mist had lifted, and the Eiffel Tower glowed in the distance. His phone buzzed with messages about tomorrow's speech. He didn't answer any of them. He placed Baldwin's book on the nightstand next to his father's cufflinks, turned off the light, and lay back, staring at the ceiling. The day had begun with exhaustion and ended with a strange, fragile hope. He closed his eyes, wondering what tomorrow would demand of him, and whether he could find the strength to meet it. The city outside whispered its endless hum, as if promising that the story wasn't over. Not yet, not for him. The phone vibrated against the nightstand long before dawn. David reached for it in the dark, blinking at the screen. Messages from Lucas and Elena, a briefing from his team in New York, and a note from a Brussels contact. A car would collect him at 8 to take him to the EU Parliament. Outside the window, Paris was only a silhouette of rooftops, a few street lamps casting pools of orange light on the wet pavement. He showered slowly, steam rising around him, then dressed in a black suit with a plain tie, tucking Baldwin's book into his briefcase. His father's cufflinks clicked softly as he fastened them. The hotel lobby was quiet, except for the faint hiss of an espresso machine. Lucas was already waiting, scrolling his phone, the glow lighting his face. "Brussels is ready for you," he said. Elena arrived moments later with her camera bag. "The networks are carrying this live," she said quietly. "They're calling you the reluctant witness." David gave a dry laugh. "I didn't want a stage. It came to me." They stepped outside into the cold air. A black sedan waited. As they drove north out of Paris, the city faded into open countryside. Fields dark with winter soil, wind turbines turning slowly in the gray distance. David pressed his forehead to the glass and watched villages slip past, each with its church spire, each waking up to its own quiet routines. He thought about his parents crossing the Atlantic decades ago on their first and only trip to Europe, taking pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and mailing postcards back to Detroit. By mid-morning they reached Brussels. The Parliament building rose like a modern fortress of glass and steel. Security guards checked their papers, led them through scanners, and up a flight of polished stairs to a conference room overlooking the city. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paint. Staffers murmured in French and Dutch. A woman with cropped hair introduced herself as Sophie van der Meer, head of the Committee on Inclusion and Digital Ethics. "Mr. Johnson," she said warmly, "thank you for coming on such short notice." David shook her hand. "I'm not sure what you expect me to say. Your experience speaks for itself," she said. "But also your ideas. Europe is at a crossroads. You've seen the promise and the failure." They led him to a small waiting lounge. Lucas whispered last minute notes while Alina adjusted her camera. David ran a thumb over Baldwin's book, feeling the texture of the paper. His heart thudded like a drum. When the doors opened, he walked into the chamber. A semi-circle of officials sat behind microphones, nameplates arranged in a neat arc. Screens on the walls displayed his name and the title of the session in Inclusion, Trust, and the Digital Age. Cameras blinked red. A low murmur filled the air. He sat at the witness table, adjusted the microphone, and looked up. He began quietly, telling them about his childhood in Detroit, his father's lessons about dignity, his company's vision for ethical data exchange. He described the conference in Paris, the dinner reservation, the denial. He did not raise his voice, but let the silence after each sentence carry its own weight. "This isn't about one restaurant," he said. "It's about the quiet patterns of exclusion that still run through our systems. Digital, social, and cultural. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about progress and the gaps we refuse to see." A few of the officials nodded, others typed notes. Sophie van der Meer asked about his company's approach to transparency. A Spanish delegate asked how personal experience shapes corporate ethics. A German member asked what Europe could learn from the American civil rights movement. David answered carefully, feeling himself grow steadier with each exchange. Halfway through, he set Baldwin's book on the table and read a line about belonging and estrangement. The chamber fell silent. Cameras clicked. When he finished, there was a ripple of applause, subdued but sincere. Sophie thanked him and said, "Your words remind us that culture is not a destination but a practice." She gestured to the rest of the panel. "We are grateful." Afterward, in a small lounge, aides brought coffee and mineral water. Journalists crowded the doorway. Lucas said, "You were brilliant." Elena whispered, "You gave them something real." "Not just policy. Humanity." David leaned against the wall, feeling drained but also lighter. "I don't know what will happen next," he said, "but for once I feel like I'm not just reacting." Later, they walked outside into the Brussels afternoon. The city smelled of rain and waffles, of diesel and coffee. Grand buildings loomed around narrow cobblestone streets. They passed a chocolatier where glossy pralines shone behind glass, a bar where men in scarves argued about football, and a plaza where a street musician played a mournful accordion tune. They ducked into a small brasserie for lunch. David ordered stoemp and sausage, a local dish Lucas recommended. The food was hearty, the beer rich and amber. For a while they spoke of nothing serious: architecture, music, the curious rhythm of European trains. David felt the tightness in his chest ease. As dusk approached, Alina led them to a bookshop near the Grand Place. She found a vintage map of Europe for David and said, "Mark the places you've been, and the places you still need to see." David unfolded it, the paper soft with age, and traced the borders with his fingertip. So many lines, so many names. That night they boarded a train back to Paris. In the window, David saw his reflection flickering over the blur of countryside. He thought about the restaurant, the chamber, the applause, and the bookshop owner's kindness. Europe had shown him its contradictions: exclusion and welcome, arrogance and humility. When they reached Paris, the station was crowded with travelers. David walked ahead of Lucas and Elena, breathing in the smell of diesel and pastry, listening to the swirl of languages around him. For the first time since arriving, he felt less like a visitor and more like a participant in something larger. Back in his hotel room, he placed the vintage map next to Baldwin's book and his father's cufflinks. He opened the window and looked out at the city's yellow lights. The world was still restless, still unfinished, but he felt, for a moment, anchored in the flow of it. He thought about his father, about the boy on the bridge with the camera, about the man at the table reading Baldwin's words to the EU. All the same person, moving through Europe, through history, through his own becoming. He whispered into the night, not as a plea but as a declaration. "I'm still here." Then he closed the window, turned off the lights, and let the city's quiet hum lull him toward sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring more questions, but also the possibility of answers he had not yet imagined. David woke before sunrise, the thin Paris light washing the room in silver. For a moment he stayed still, listening to the hum of the city beneath him, the rattle of early buses, the murmur of a street sweeper, a far-off train horn. The vintage map lay folded on the desk beside Baldwin's book and his father's cufflinks. He traced the map's creases with a fingertip, feeling the continent beneath the paper like a pulse. His phone blinked with notifications, but he didn't open them. Instead, he dressed in a simple shirt and jacket, slipped the cufflinks into his pocket like talismans, and stepped out into the cool morning. Lucas and Alina were waiting near the hotel door, each holding a small bag of pastries. They walked silently toward the river, watching the city wake. Paris at dawn felt almost tender. Market stalls were being set up, delivery bikes zipped past. On a bridge, an old man painted the skyline, his brush moving slow and deliberate. David stopped to watch, noticing the subtle shades of gray and gold. The man nodded to him without words. They turned toward a small cafe near the Marais, where Elena had arranged a quiet breakfast meeting with two cultural historians. The cafe smelled of strong coffee and butter. Inside, the tables were small and wood, polished, candles flickering even in daylight. The historians, a French woman named Claire and a Belgian man named Henry, greeted David warmly. They had followed the story, they said, but wanted to talk less about scandal and more about history. Over croissants and espresso, they spoke about Europe's complicated legacy. Empires and migrations, borders drawn and erased, identities negotiated over centuries. Claire said softly, "Every culture here is a palimpsest. You can't scrape away the past without seeing the scars." Henry added, "But you can also choose how you carry it forward." David listened, feeling the ideas settle inside him. "In the U.S., he said, we're taught that Europe is old and fixed, but this morning it feels more like a living argument." Henry smiled. "Exactly. The question is whether you want to join the argument or turn away from it." After breakfast, they walked together to a museum tucked into a former palace. Inside, paintings hung in high, ceilinged rooms, marble statues glowed under skylights, and a hush blanketed everything. David stopped in front of a 19th century canvas showing a black figure in a European court scene, painted with dignity, but clearly on the margins of the composition. He stared at it for a long time. Elena raised her camera, but then lowered it, sensing he wanted the moment unrecorded. Later, in the museum cafe, David received a message from the EU Parliament thanking him for his testimony and inviting him to return next year. He closed the email without replying. "I don't want to be a symbol," he said under his breath. "I just want to be." By mid-afternoon, they took a train to Lyon to visit one of Lucas's old friends, a chef who ran a small restaurant in the Croix, Rousse district. The train rolled through fields and villages, each station a flicker of lives David would never know. As they approached Lyon, the sky cleared and a pale sun washed the hills. The restaurant was tucked into a narrow street paved with cobblestones, its sign hand-painted, its windows fogged with steam. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary and roasted meat. The chef, a wary man named Adrian, greeted Lucas with a hug, then shook David's hand firmly. "I saw what happened in Paris," he said. "Here, you're safe." They sat at a wooden table by the kitchen. Adrian served them a rustic meal: lentils, duck confit, a salad of bitter greens. The flavors were deep and earthy. David felt something unclench inside him. He wasn't a guest at a spectacle, but part of a room, a table. Over wine they spoke about food as a form of culture, about how recipes carry memory across borders. Adrian said, "A dish only survives if someone loves it enough to cook it again. Maybe it's the same with justice." David nodded slowly, thinking of Baldwin's book, thinking of his father's cufflinks. As evening fell, they walked up to the old amphitheater at the top of the hill. The stone seats overlooked the city, glowing below. David sat on a worn step and felt the wind move around him, carrying scents of pine and stone dust. Elena filmed a few seconds of the view, then sat beside him. "Do you regret coming?" she asked quietly. "Not anymore," David said. "Europe isn't what I thought, but maybe I'm not what I thought either." They stayed until the lights of the city flickered on. Lucas checked his phone. "We should head back," he said. "The train leaves soon." Back in Paris that night, David walked alone along the Seine. The bridges glowed. The water mirrored the city's lights. He thought of the Mac Tradi's face, of Sophie van der Meer's gratitude, of Adrian's kitchen, of the old painting in the museum. Europe had not given him one story, but many, overlapping like the map on his desk. He stopped on a bridge and leaned over the railing, the river sliding black beneath him. A young couple walked past laughing. A cyclist zipped by. Somewhere an accordion played faintly. He closed his eyes and breathed in the cold air. When he returned to his hotel room, he placed Adrian's handwritten menu next to the cufflinks, the map, and Baldwin's book. He realized the collection had become a kind of altar to the journey. He poured himself a glass of water, sat on the edge of the bed, and whispered to the dark, "This isn't the end. It's a beginning." Outside, the city hummed, patient and alive. The morning he was scheduled to fly home, David woke before the alarm again. The sky over Paris was pearl gray, the rooftops still wet from a night of light rain. He packed slowly, folding the suit he had worn in Brussels, sliding Baldwin's book, the vintage map, Adrian's menu, and his father's cufflinks into the inner pocket of his carry-on. He paused before zipping the bag, running his hand over the cufflinks like a blessing. Downstairs, Lucas and Elena were waiting with coffee and croissants wrapped in paper. They didn't talk much on the drive to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The city receded in the window, the morning markets, the bakeries, the bridges, the sign glinting faintly. For David it felt as if Europe itself were slowly exhaling him back out into the world. Inside the terminal, people surged toward flights for Tokyo, New York, and Nairobi. David checked his ticket and passed through security. Lucas clasped his shoulder. "Stay in touch," he said. "You've got allies here now." Elena hugged him briefly, whispering, "Don't let the noise drown out the real story. You're still living it." On the plane, David took a window seat. As the aircraft lifted off, the city tilted beneath him. The serpentine river, the pale avenues, the miniature monuments. He thought about the restaurant in Paris, the parliament in Brussels, the museum painting, Adrian's kitchen, and the old painter on the bridge. He thought of his father and his own younger self. He felt the map of Europe in his mind like a circuit that had been completed. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he opened Baldwin's book and read a few lines he had underlined in pencil about carrying history without letting it break you, about the duty of witness. He closed the book, rested his head against the window, and let the engine's steady roar fill his ears. For the first time in days, he slept deeply. He woke as the plane began its descent over New York. The skyline rose through the clouds, sharp and familiar. The city looked both the same and utterly new, as if his eyes had been recalibrated. When the plane touched down, he felt a small tremor of relief and something like grief for what he was leaving behind. Customs, baggage claim, the muted chaos of arrivals. Outside, a driver held a sign with his name. The car rolled into Manhattan, past the brick apartments, the bodegas, the flashing crosswalks. David watched it all with the same alertness he had felt in Europe. The driver asked if he'd been traveling for business or pleasure. David said, both, and left it at that. Back in his apartment, the city noise rose like a tide outside the windows. He unpacked slowly, placing Baldwin's book on his nightstand, pinning the vintage map to the wall, setting the cufflinks on a shelf where he could see them. He left Adrian's handwritten menu folded inside the book as a bookmark. His phone buzzed endlessly, interview requests, speaking invitations, messages of outrage and support. He let them pile up. He brewed himself coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at the morning light on the floorboards. He remembered the museum painting, the small bistro, the Parliament chamber, and realized that each moment had become a part of him. Later, walking through Central Park, he noticed small things he had always overlooked. A street musician's fingers on a guitar string, a woman in a sari feeding birds, the smell of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart. He felt the echo of Europe in the rhythm of the city, as if he carried a second lens through which to see. When evening came, he sat on his balcony with his laptop open, but untouched. He took the cufflinks in his hand, feeling their cool metal weight, and thought of his father. He whispered, "I went. I saw. I'm still here." Below, the city hummed its endless song. David closed his eyes, breathing in the autumn air, and for the first time since the night at La Belle Époque, he felt whole. Not defined by the moment of exclusion, but by everything that had come after: the witnesses, the conversations, the maps, the meals, the quiet mornings and unexpected kindnesses. In the distance, the skyline glowed, and for a moment he imagined all the cities of Europe glowing too, connected by invisible lines, each one full of people who might yet do better. He didn't know what the next chapter of his public story would be, but he knew the private one would go on, in the choices he made and the way he carried himself. As the sky deepened into twilight, David placed Baldwin's book on the table beside him, set the cufflinks next to it, and let the hum of the city surround him. He was home, but he was also changed. Not just a man who had been denied, but a man who had crossed an ocean and found, in the fractures of another culture, a mirror of his own. David stood on the balcony of his apartment as night settled over the city, the hum of Manhattan drifting upward like a living tide. In his hand he held the cufflinks that had crossed the Atlantic with him, small fragments of his father's past, cool and solid against his palm. Across the river the skyline shimmered, and for a heartbeat he imagined Paris, Brussels, Berlin and Milan shimmering too. Cities bound together, not only by commerce and politics, but by the quiet, stubborn insistence of people who wanted better. The story of his trip, the restaurant's rejection, the headlines, the protests, the parliament floor, the small gestures of kindness, had already begun to blur into something larger. It was no longer just an outrage or a viral clip. It had become a kind of map charting how a single moment could ignite a conversation, how private pain could spark public reckoning, how culture and history intertwined. He thought of Lucas and Elena, of Adrian's kitchen, of the museum's old painting. He thought of his own younger self and of the thousands of strangers who had written to say they'd been inspired or comforted by his resilience. He understood now that the real power of what happened was not the scandal, but the connection it created. a network of people across continents, suddenly awakened to the small injustices that add up to a world. The city lights flickered below, car horns and sirens weaving their nocturne. David slipped the cufflinks back into his pocket and breathed in the cool air. What had begun as a humiliating night in a restaurant had turned into a test, a pilgrimage, and, ultimately, a return. He had gone to Europe as a CEO attending a conference. He had come home as a witness, a bridge, a man changed. He didn't know if the world would change overnight. He didn't know if the restaurant would survive, or if European policy would shift. But he knew he would keep speaking, keep building, keep reaching across the spaces where prejudice had lived. His father's words echoed softly, "Don't let them decide your worth." Below him, the city glowed, pulsing with lives and languages and dreams. David let the sounds wash over him and, for the first time since the incident, felt at peace. He had been denied, but he had also been seen. He had been hurt, but he had also been heard. And in that complicated space between rejection and recognition, a new story had begun. One that belonged to more than just him. With a final look at the skyline, he turned back inside, the map of Europe still pinned to his wall. It would stay there as a reminder of what had happened, of what he had learned, and of what was still possible when someone chooses to cross the ocean, face the truth, and come home stronger.